Hello and welcome to EBible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your speaker, Chris McCann. If you'd like more information or to hear more studies, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.com. And now, with your evening Bible study, here's Chris McCann.
Good evening and welcome to EBible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Revelation. Tonight is study number 13 of Revelation chapter 18. And we're going to be reading verses 6 and 7. Revelation 18, verse 6. Reward her even as she rewarded you, and double unto her double according to her works. In the cup which she has filled, fill to her double. How much she has glorified herself and lived deliciously, so much torment and sorrow give her. For she saith in her heart, I sit a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. And we're continuing in our study of Revelation 18 as God is getting into the discussion of the fall of Babylon, which is a picture of the fall of the kingdom of Satan, of the nations of the world, of all the unsaved inhabitants of the earth in the spiritual realm as they worship Satan. Well, when Judgment Day began, and it did begin on May 21, 2011, then Babylon fell, Satan was deposed, and the language of Revelation 18 took effect. And we saw in the first part of the verse, reward her even as she rewarded you, that the word reward had to do with payment for sin and rendering unto God that which is owed him, as mankind has sinned against his law and transgressed, and therefore the law demands payment. The law of God demands satisfaction, which is death ultimately. And when God shut the door of heaven, he brought unsaved man into the condition of death or the grave, and also into the condition of hell, as hell and the grave are synonymous, because he guaranteed their destruction. And it's only a matter of time for the period of Judgment Day to expire, and then will come the completion of all things, the end of the world, and the final death of every unsaved individual. It will be the complete destruction of mankind as the Lord will annihilate them. So God says, reward her, Babylon, even as she rewarded you, because Babylon had been a golden cup in the hand of the Lord to, as God meted out judgment upon the churches and congregations. Well, now it's Babylon's turn. And then it goes on to say, and double unto her double according to her works. In the cup which she has filled, fill to her double. So the picture is, of course, that Babylon was instrumental in giving so much judgment to the church, to the outward representation of the kingdom of heaven. And Babylon, Satan, the king of Babylon, and his subjects relished the task of bringing destruction to the corporate church. Well, they brought so much destruction to a certain level, a certain degree, and now it's as though God measured that destruction, and he's now saying the level of destruction that Babylon brought upon the church, I want you to bring double to her. It is twice as much. And the word double that's used here, it's Strong's 1362 and 1363 in these verses in Revelation 18 verse 6 is translated one place twice as much. That's exactly what it means. Give to her twice as much wrath, twice as much of the cup of the wrath of God, measure it out to her as she had been that cup in Jehovah's hand. Now the cup will be given to Babylon to the degree of double. It will be twice as much. And of course we can't really measure the degree of God's wrath that he poured out upon the churches over a 23-year period. How much wrath is that? And how could we ever double that? We have no way of knowing how to exactly bring double the punishment to Babylon or to the unsaved inhabitants of the earth as those in the churches and congregations receive. And there's also another problem as we think about this, because here God is speaking of Babylon, which is really the nations of the world or the unsaved people of the world, and he is saying, double unto Babylon wrath. The wrath that I gave first to the church was so much. Well, now the wrath to the people of the world will be double. And that's a problem. Why is that a problem? Well, because God speaks elsewhere in the Scripture of the one knowing his will receiving more stripes than the ones that did not know his will. As we read in Luke chapter 12, it says in verse 47, "And that servant which knew his Lord's will and prepared not himself, neither did according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes. But he that knew not and did commit things worthy of stripes shall be beaten with few stripes. For unto whomsoever much is given, of him shall be much required, and to whom men have committed much, of him they will ask the more." So that presents a problem when we're thinking of Babylon as the Gentiles, the kingdoms of the world, the nations that are in the kingdom of darkness under Satan's rule, and God used Satan and his kingdom to bring judgment on the corporate church. And it's the corporate church, the professed Christians, that we would say knew the Lord's will more so than the Gentiles, than the people of the nations that are in the kingdom of Babylon. And so we really have a problem, because it appears that in Revelation 18:6, if Babylon represents the world, the nations under Satan's dominion, that God is saying, give them more wrath than the church. And that would contradict what we just read in Luke chapter 12. Oh, but there's a solution. There is a way of understanding exactly what God is saying, and it solves any problem. There's no contradiction of any kind. Once we realize that the judgment on the churches is likened to the judgment of the third part. And we see this especially in Revelation chapter 8. It says in verse 9 of Revelation 8, "And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. And it fell upon the third part of the rivers, and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died of the waters, because they were made bitter. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise." And then in the next verse, God goes on to transition from judgment on the third part to the inhabitants of the earth. Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. Because the judgment that we just read in Revelation 8 on the third part is a judgment on the corporate church, on the churches and congregations of the world, numbering about 2 billion people when God began judgment on them, and throughout the 23-year judgment on the churches of the world, and yet typified by the third part, because in Zechariah chapter 13, God speaks of the true believers, his elect, as being the third part. And the elect were found in the church throughout the almost 2,000 years of the church age. That's where you would find God's elect. That's where you would find the third part, located in the local congregations. And so since the third part were in the church throughout, 1955 years of the church age is a very long time, that the churches became identified with the third part. And it says in Revelation 13, verse 8 and 9, "And it shall come to pass that in all the land, or in all the earth, saith Jehovah, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but the third shall be left therein, and I will bring the third part through the fire, and will refine them as silver is refined, and will try them as gold is tried. They shall call my name, and I will hear them. I will say, it is my people." So the corporate church, where the people of God were located and identified with, took upon itself the identification of the third part, or God gave them that identification. When judgment began at the house of God, it was a judgment on the third part of the waters, the third part of the ships, the third part of the sun, the moon, the stars, and so forth, to indicate judgment on the church, not on the world as yet. Not until we get to Revelation 8:13, the concluding verse, does God transition and say, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. And then the next 3 woes, Revelation 9 and following, are focused on the final judgment of the nations of the world. And so the judgment that Babylon was instrumental in meting out, as God used Babylon, he called Nebuchadnezzar my servant. Historically, in the Old Testament, it was Babylon that destroyed Judea, and Judea was a type and a figure of the church. And so Babylon destroyed, in a figure, the third part. They were the ones that conquered Judah and destroyed the temple and so forth. So they destroyed the outward representation of the kingdom of God, or the representation of the third part. And Babylon destroyed the third part. And so God says, again in Revelation 18, he has that judgment in mind, double unto her double according to her works. In the cup which she has filled, fill to her double. Now, if the third part, and the third part is a third, it would be 0.333 if you're writing it as a decimal. If the third part identifies with the people of God in the congregations, then what does that leave for identification with the rest of the world, or the nations of the world? Well, that would leave the 2/3, as we also read in Zechariah 13 in verse 8, "And it shall come to pass that in all the land, saith Jehovah, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but the third part shall be left therein." 2 parts is 2/3, and that's the spiritual figure that God gives to the unsaved inhabitants of the earth. Everyone outside of the churches and congregations, we could say, is typified by 2/3, or 0.666 if you're writing it as a decimal. And that is the number that God picks up on in Revelation chapter 13. When he speaks of the number of man, he says in Revelation 13 verse 18, "Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man," it says in the King James, when it really should read, it is the number of man, not a man, but of man, mankind in general. It is the number of man, and his number is 666. 2/3. It is 2/3 that are unsaved. And when we look at what God is saying in Revelation 18 verse 6, "Double unto her double, according to her works, in the cup which she has filled." And again, that cup Babylon filled had to do with 1/3. It was the judgment on the church. Well, in the cup she has filled, fill to her double. And what is double of 1/3? It is 2/3. 2/3 is twice as much as 1/3. And now we understand what God is saying. He's not talking about the degree of wrath that the unsaved of the nations outside of the church, that they are to experience a more terrible judgment, greater punishment. No, that can't be, because Luke 12 makes it clear that those that knew the Lord's will, they will receive more stripes than those that did not know as much of the Lord's will. And so those in the church receive greater punishment, the unsaved in the congregations, greater wrath than the unsaved of the world outside of the church. And we've discussed that before, how that could be. And yet, in the sense of the type and the figure, it is double the wrath, or it is double the cup of wrath that's being meted out, because God gave a cup of wrath first to the city called by his name, to the third part. And now, finally, the nations are not getting away unpunished. Oh no, God will requite them, and is currently pouring out his wrath and taking vengeance. And he has now filled the cup twice as much to cover 2/3 of all the unsaved inhabitants of the earth. And so it is using the figure. Of course, the numbers are not exactly 1/3 and 2/3. It's just the spiritual figure God has assigned to the corporate church and to unsaved men. Using the figure, it is double destruction. It is double the cup of wrath. Now, just one other thing here in verse 6. "Double unto her double, according to her works." And we, I think, went over that last time, that when God is looking at people, he sees either the individual person's work of whatever they have done in their life, whatever attempt they have made to live a good life, to obey God, to keep his commandments, to live a moral, decent life, and it always falls short. Because if you go that route, if you try to get right with God through the keeping of the law, you must do it perfectly. And therefore, when God views the works of any person trying to get right with him on that basis, they're evil works. And that person is under the wrath of God, and that is the case with every unsaved individual in the world. But on the other hand, God looks at his elect, and he does not see their individual works. You know, there are some people that get confused about that, because the Bible does say that we have been ordained to walk in good works. God has prepared for us to perform the doing of. Yes, that's true. But again, when God is looking at us, he's not looking at our works. If he did, we also would fall short. But he's looking at the works of Christ, the finished, perfect, complete work of the Lord on our behalf. Those are the works, the work of faith that Jesus performed at the point of the world's foundation in dying for us. That's the acceptable work, the acceptable offering that Abel made. And why Abel's works were said to be righteous? Because it wasn't his work. It was the work of Christ he was trusting in, and the work of Christ performed on his behalf. And that's always the case when God looks at one of his elect people. He sees the work of Christ. The righteousness of Christ is what makes them righteous in his sight. Well, double according to her works, and the cup which she has filled, fill to her double. And the Greek word translated as filled, which is found twice in this verse, she is filled to her double, is only found one other place in the New Testament, and that's in Revelation 14, also in the context of Babylon's fall, as Revelation 14:8 says Babylon is fallen, and in the context of the cup of the wrath of God, as it says in verses 9 and 10, and the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. The word poured out is the same word filled that we have in Revelation 18:6. And so we see the tie-in through the use of this word with the cup of God's wrath being given to the unsaved inhabitants of the earth in the day of judgment. And this further strengthens the Bible's teaching that the cup being referred to here, that Babylon is to drink, is indeed the cup of the wrath of God at the end of the world in the day of judgment.
Thanks for joining us for EBible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies. You can hear these studies Monday through Friday over Paltalk, Skype, EBible Fellowship's webcast audio, or over your phone. For more information or to hear other studies, visit www.ebiblefellowship.com. Until our next study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.